This year marks 100 years since the Chicago race riot. It's a tragic event that has shaped politics and race relations in the city.
Not a lot of Chicagoans know this story, but there's a push to educate and explore solutions to problems today that harkens back to this very difficult period in our history. WGN's Tanya Francisco has more.
1919 was the year of racial uprisings. It was dubbed the Red Summer by author James Weldon Johnson. There were more than 36 race riots in cities across the country, but none were as violent or as deadly as the one in Chicago. Chicago, circa 1919, was a city on edge. Much like Ferguson, Missouri in the summer of 2014, and Baltimore in the spring of 2015.
I was watching these images on my TV screen, and it called up that memory of my grandmother's story, and I wanted to find out, what was this riot in 1919?
Claire Hartfield is the author of A Few Red Drops, a book about the Chicago race riot. She learned about the notorious chapter of Chicago's history as a child from her grandmother, who was caught in the violence as she rode a streetcar.
Looked out her window, she saw these mobs, growing mobs of young men, black men and white men, in the streets, fighting fiercely and throwing rocks at the streetcar.
Turns out that was the first of 5 days of the most violent rioting the city has ever seen. At the time, Chicago was a tinderbox of racial tensions. White soldiers returning from World War I were afraid they wouldn't get their high-paying jobs in the stockyards and meat-packing plants back, while blacks who had been recruited from the South to fill them feared they would be fired. Black soldiers returning from the war refused to put up with racial discrimination after they had risked their lives for the country. Union differences also fueled the anger. Whites were in favor of the better pay and job protections unions could provide, while blacks worried about discrimination. Politically, whites were staunchly Democratic, while blacks were Republicans, the party of Lincoln who freed the slaves. And overcrowding and poor housing conditions contributed to the divide. The black community, which had more than doubled from nearly 50,000 to more than 100,000 in 2 short years, was mostly restricted to living in a small area on the south side called the Black Belt. When they tried to move out, they faced backlash.
Part of that backlash was violent, with bombings, and part of that backlash was more technical, where groups of real estate associations got together and instructed people in their neighborhoods, don't sell or rent to any black families that are coming your way.
In short, Chicago was a city just waiting to explode, and it did on July 27th.
It was horrific. It was the worst riot in Chicago history.
It was sparked by an incident at 29th Street Beach. A group of black teens were on a raft playing around and didn't realize they had drifted over an invisible line into the white part of the beach. A white man became infuriated and started throwing rocks. 17-year-old Eugene Williams ended up drowning, either from being hit by one of the rocks or from being too afraid to swim back to shore.
This is Connecting Chicago.
Lisa Lolson is the director of Chicago Studies at Newberry Library.
That moment of violence really ignited the city, which was brimming, seething with racial tensions leading up to that moment.
Anger began to build when a white police officer refused to arrest the man accused of throwing the rock, and false rumors quickly spread throughout the community as the story became distorted about who died and why.
There were some gangs, some white immigrant gangs that had been waiting to foment violence, and this was their moment. So they went to their clubhouses, they got their guns, they went into the black community, and from there it just exploded.
There were beatings and bombings. 38 people ended up dying, more than 500 were injured. It caused millions of dollars in property damage while leaving about 1,000 families, mostly black, homeless. Peace was eventually restored when the governor called in the National Guard and a hard driving rain forced people inside. It was later determined Irish-American gangs from nearby Bridgeport were the main instigators of the rioting.
And those boys grow up to be our civic leaders. And that's real, and the powerful political machines that have ruled Chicago in those 100 years, what are their interests? How has Chicago been built out of that kind of civic leadership?
One 17-year-old gang member in particular, Richard J. Daley, went on to become the longtime mayor of Chicago. Daley never confirmed nor denied whether he took part in the rioting, but his supporters have said he had no involvement. In 1922, the Chicago Commission on Race Relations was formed to take a deep dive into the cause and consequences of the riot. It released a 672-page report titled The Negro in Chicago, a study of race relations and a race riot.
It was a call for the community as a whole to take ownership and responsibility and be accountable for what was going on broadly in our city, and to come together and to do something about it.
The report was written by a black sociologist named Charles Johnson, who had been working for the Chicago Urban League at the time of the riots. Barbara Lumpkin is the interim president and CEO of the civil rights organization.
So our work is very important still, and the work that we do is just as relevant today as it was in 1919.
Today, the Chicago Urban League is one of 14 cultural institutions across the city, including the Newberry Library, taking part in a year-long exploration of the history and legacy of the 1919 Chicago race riot.
We want to think hard about how 1919 is really a moment that helps us understand so many of the problems that Chicago is still grappling with.
The approach, perhaps, to how we address some of the issues that we are facing is slightly different, but the core issues remain the same.
But the reality, according to Claire Hartfield,
We still have a long way to go.
it's no doubt a difficult period in Chicago's history to face, but the hope is by opening it up to conversation, a way forward can be found. Tanya Francisco, WGN News.